Welcome to the Maverick House podcast. Today we are speaking to Declan Power, the author of The Siege of Jadotville. In today's podcast, Declan discusses why he wrote his book, which is currently being adapted for film.
It was a story that hadn't been told, a story that existed within the Irish Army on a colloquial level, in a kind of at a nearly mythological level, that was just talked about in a very general way as an episode within the Congo. And it fascinated me that there had been nothing documented properly about it. That was when I heard about it when I was still serving in the army, and it stayed in my head. And years later, when I was gone out of the army and I was working in different areas and working in media, I thought it would be a suitable topic for a book that would interest readers, because it's a damn good yarn as stories about conflict, battles and warfare go. It's also an untold story that involves Irish troops, and there were a number of different motivating factors, including the fact, I have to say, that at a political level I have a strong concern that a lot of our political masters, a lot of our citizens in general, have very little knowledge about what it is that Irish soldiers do when they go on overseas operations. A company under Commandant Pat Quinlan from Carey were part of the 35th Infantry Battalion, who had been sent to the Congo to assist in the restoration of peace and stability. But as things happen on these operations, a number of permutations occurred that led to one state, Katanga, seceding from the rest of the Congo, and it was the mineral wealthy region of the Congo. So therefore, the powers that be within the UN were faced with a dilemma. To restore stability, you need to have an economic system that will allow people be able to feed themselves, and for the country to sustain itself. And that was highly unlikely to happen with regards to Katanga seceding. So the UN were faced with a very unusual dilemma, and that was they had to push Katanga back into the Congo proper and not recognise its independence. And that led to the UN force within the Congo being put on a war footing. Now, it's one thing to give a resolution on paper that you now have the right to engage in combat operations, but what the powers that be within the UN hadn't really thought about was configuring the UN force to actually fight a limited conflict with a fairly well organised Katangan gendarmerie, a Katangan military force that was officered and led by a mixture of Belgian and French mercenaries, professional soldiers, a mixture of officers and non-commissioned officers who had experience from World War II, from the various colonial wars in Indochina, who knew how to command troops in extremely difficult conflict situations, who knew how to manage and sight and operate weapon systems of a fairly complex nature. And then at their disposal they had a large amount of indigenous manpower from the Katangan region. So the UN was faced against that. It wasn't, as an awful lot of people, Irish people in particular, think, ranged against tribesmen with bows and arrows. Well, the deployment of troops to Jadotville itself, despite the fact that some of the transport bringing the troops and equipment broke down, so it meant that not all of their full array of weapons arrived with them to the location, which was a little bit of a setback to begin with. But other than that, in as much as what Quinlan and his troops could control themselves, that went very well. They were assigned an area by the UN to billet the troops in. Now, this was largely done by the UN from a civilian perspective. They were looking for an area that could house X amount of troops. And Quinlan was assigned an area called Perfina Garage on the outskirts of Jadotville. And when he arrived, he billeted, he billeted his troops so that they were located there, and he established relations with the local civil authority, the Burgermeister of Jadotville, who let him know from the get-go that he wasn't welcome. He and his troops weren't welcome. They didn't want the UN there. They didn't see any need for them. And Quinlan reported that back to High Command and queried as to why they were there, as had the previous larger force done so under a Swedish major called Mida, who was called Force Mida because it was a combination of a Swedish company and an Irish company. Now we had just one Irish company that didn't have all its support weapons. in an area that they were being told they weren't welcome, and the objective was to protect people who didn't want them there. So this was passed up the chain of command to the UN headquarters, and they chose to do nothing about that. At that point, Quinlan knew no more than that. His orders were to stay put. And he also started to notice that there was a lot of mercenary-led Katangan gendarmerie activity around his positions. And they were starting to deploy large amounts of troops, large amounts of weaponry. They were controlling the bridge that over the Lafira River, which was the main route between his troops and support from Elizabethville. And this was a source of concern, obviously, to Cumann and Quinlan. From a tactical point of view, it was reducing his ability to protect his troops and to defend his position and to get reinforcements. This was communicated back to UN headquarters, who at this stage weren't really paying much attention and didn't give much of a stuff about this small contingent at Jadotville. Why? Because they were getting ready for a big UN-led operation to move against the Katangan government and forces and effectively end their secession from the Congo and invade the whole area. And this was Operation Mortar.
Can you describe what happened to Quinlan and his men at Jadotville when they were attacked?
So against that backdrop, they were attacked at a time when a major UN operation called Operation Mortar was taking place in Elizabethville, trying to clear out the mercenary forces. Quinlan's men weren't told about that. Now, part of that may have been due to faulty radios. The radio sets that the Irish were using were of a very poor quality at the time. But also, even if when they did manage successful radio transmissions, it is unusual, and a number of the veterans, particularly those who held command positions during the battle, told me of their own surprise that their commanding officer was never told about this other larger operation. And effectively, Quinlan had only his own military common sense and nous to rely on at this point. He wasn't getting much in the line of information from higher authority, and he had to make his own decisions and do what, as a commander, you're trained to do, which is to make an estimate of the situation and then act accordingly. And one of the most important things he did at that time, and which undoubtedly saved the lives of his men, was that rather than staying billeted in buildings as the UN had originally instructed him to do so, he ordered his men to dig into defensive positions, what is known in classic military terms as company in defence. And that's, you dig trenches, not like World War I, but fighting trenches that would have no more than about 3, 4 maximum, and sometimes just 2 men to them, so that your company of troops, which is subdivided into platoons, are divided up. Each platoon controls a sector of all-round defence, if you think about it from a circular point of view. And then within each platoon, those platoons of 30-odd men are divided into these 2 to 4 man trenches that have interlocking fields of fire. So it means that they're under cover if they've dug down into the ground. They're able to coordinate their fire so that it's very hard for an attacking force to move into their positions without taking lots of casualties. And it's for that reason that Quinlan and A Company were able to sustain and defend against the first attack by the mercenaries, which had been coming for a while. The mercenaries had launched a number of feint attacks. They had been trying to intimidate them, driving up close to their positions, and they had been gathering intelligence from some of the Belgian settlers that were in closer to the area. But also the Irish had an advantage. There was an Irish engineer by the name of Carey working for one of the big companies. I think it was probably Union Miniere, and he knew that there was an attack massing, and phone lines were still in existence between the garage, which was in the Irish positions, and the village and the town of Jadotville, and he would regularly ring with updates, which gave Quinlan and his men an opportunity to be prepared. But he didn't have exact details, and one of the things that happened was one of the platoons was attending mass, and the attack was launched in that area against that platoon. But there were sentries on duty, and the alarm was raised, and the company stood to and repulsed the first attack. And then over the course of a week, the Irish positions were attacked countlessly with a large force that at one time is said to have numbered up to 3,000 troops, which sounds somewhat fantastic. It sounds a little bit over the top, but what one has to remember is that, again, A Company, the troops were very well trained in the basics of soldiering. They hadn't a lot of experience in going to war or Africa, but they had very good skill at arms. They had very good instructors. They were non-commissioned officers. They trusted. Their officers were well trained in terms of being able to control the men and coordinate their firepower, which is a very important aspect of soldiering. That's what differentiates trained soldiers from a mob with guns. That a good officer and good NCOs will ensure that the firepower is coordinated and directed and disciplined. And it was that response from the Irish company that broke the back of the attacks, to the point then that those larger numbers weren't as much use, because an awful lot of the troops were indigenous cannon fodder that were recruited by the Katangans, who weren't very well trained. Now, the other advantage, though, the actual advantage that the mercenary forces had, was that they did have additional support weapons, mortars, light artillery, and they had mercenary soldiers who were well trained in the use of that. And that did cause a lot of damage. They also had an aircraft, which the UN had none to intercept. One jet aircraft that could fly over the positions and strafe them with machine gun fire and drop small munitions. And again, it was to the credit of Quinlan and his leadership that he managed to keep his men from panicking under those attacks. And again, it was the military common sense he displayed by having his men dig in. And then in the early stages of the battle, he realised that the positions he had them dig into and occupy were probably a little bit too wide and too broad of a perimeter to control for an ongoing series of attacks. So under cover of night, he had his troops dig other positions behind the lines, and he rotated, he moved his men back to a tighter, more consolidated set of dug-in positions. And that protected them. It enabled them to, again, be a very tight, cohesive unit that had interlocking fields of fire that the mercenaries just couldn't penetrate. The advantage was with the Katangans, both numbers-wise, munitions-wise, and air support-wise. The advantages that Quinlan had was that he had a good natural ability to judge the situation tactically by getting his men to dig in and sighting the trenches, and later resighting the trenches in a tighter configuration so they could better defend themselves. And also his coordination and control of the firepower of his company. And they were able to sustain themselves effectively for the guts of a week in heavy fighting, without losing any men, without any fatalities. They had a number of casualties, but it's remarkable that A Company managed to survive a week of heavy fighting without anybody being killed. And that was down to, again, just the sense of having configured the trenches in such a way as that they were able to defend themselves pretty well. The end result was that they managed to fight their Katangan opponents to a standstill, where the Katangans sought a ceasefire. During all this, the problem that Quinlan had was, unlike most other military formations, he wasn't getting regular communications with his headquarters, and when he was only getting vague directions. Nobody was telling him about what was happening with the bigger operation emanating from Elizabethville, so he was in this isolated tactical space, which is the worst place any military commander can be. He didn't know what was going on around him, and that completely denuded his position strategically. So when he was in ceasefire and he was being put under pressure to surrender, the only instructions he was getting from headquarters at that point, in as much as he was getting instructions, was to hold out, that reinforcements were on the way, and that air support was on the way. Now, 2 attempts were made to reinforce his position from Elizabethville. A column of troops attempted to cross Lafira Bridge, but they were beaten back both times, and the bridge was the only point of river crossing, as the other bridges had been blown. And again, the UN did not have any air support at the time, so the Fouga jet, being flown by a French mercenary pilot, had complete license to maraud the troops both at Jadotville and at Lafira. Eventually he realised that the air support had not materialised that he was being promised. But more importantly, the Katangan regime realised that the air support it wasn't coming, because it had been prevented from passing over the airspace of a neighbouring country, a neighbouring African country. And so they knew more about his situation than he did himself. So he was put under pressure at that point to surrender in order to save the lives of his men. And he made the right decision on the basis that sacrificing the lives of his men when he had no objective would have been madness. His objective was to protect the townspeople of Jadotville. At this point, the townspeople of Jadotville were in total cooperation with the mercenary-led Katangan force. They didn't want the UN there. They were Belgian white mercenaries whose interests were with Katanga staying independent, and a lot of them were involved in supporting the attacks on the Irish positions themselves. So he had no choice but to do what he did. The problem was afterwards, a lot of people within the Irish Army establishment looked on Jadotville as a disgrace. They didn't really study it from the point of view of seeing the tactics that were employed, the skill of arms of all ranks, but most importantly, Quinlan and his officers and NCOs in terms of the management and leadership. And so it was shoved under the carpet. I think the book itself was a great step forward. It was more successful than I would have imagined in terms of capturing the imaginations of Irish people about the event, about setting the record straight about what had happened and about the skill of arms of those involved. What the film, I think, now will do is it will take that to a higher level. It will bring this to a much wider audience. And I think will also go beyond just the events of Jadotville, but it will provoke some thoughts about the ideas behind the deployment of troops and UN operations, what's involved. I mean, there was a lot of broader issues that came to light that I touched on in the book that I think the film will be able to illustrate in a more dramatic way about when you put troops in a situation and on paper you change the rules from a light peacekeeping police type operation to a major peace enforcement operation. But if you don't redraw the configuration of the troops and you don't give them the equipment and the opportunity to plan and the support necessary, you'll have disaster in their hands. And the Congo operation, I wouldn't call it a disaster, but there were a number of disasters within that operation, and it was a very important piece of the UN and international history, because if the UN had not intervened and deployed, it could have become a major flashpoint of the Cold War, because the new Congo state was lurching from one client to another. It was looking for support from the US and the West, it was looking for support from the Russia, it was looking for support from the Chinese. It didn't care who it got support from in order to try and restore its stability. And Katanga, had it seceded, could have probably been a very successful African state, but then would the Congo have imploded? There's a lot of interesting debating points that can be looked at. The Congo, I work regularly in Africa myself with other work that I do, and it is probably one of the most dangerous parts of Africa to this day. There's an argument to be made that maybe should Katanga have been allowed to secede. One thing that we often like to pride ourselves in Ireland is that since becoming a state, we've never been involved in offensive, belligerent action. We've never invaded another country. But actually, if you want to be really, really particular about it, we did. When Katanga declared itself independent, as part of the UN forces, we invaded it to push it back into the Congo. And for Irish people, I think it's an interesting point, because people will say, oh, well, it didn't have the legality of a new state. Well, I'm sorry, where did Ireland get its legality to be a new state? Granted, there was no United Nations when Ireland declared its independence. But what I'm saying is that, international relations, international geopolitics it's a murky business. It's an inexact science. And I think that the beauty of the story of Jadotville is it's a very succinct story about a siege at a place in the Congo, but it provokes questions and thoughts about a much broader set of issues that are just as relevant to us today.